Have you ever paused, really paused in the middle of your busy day and wondered, what is all this striving for? Why do we chase after success, relationships, experiences, always hoping that the next thing will finally make us feel complete? And yet, no matter how much we gain, there's a subtle emptiness that lingers, like a faint ache we can't quite name. There's a quiet question that has haunted the human heart for as long as we've looked up at the stars. What if the peace we've been searching for isn't somewhere out there, but right here, waiting in the silent spaces between our thoughts? The Buddha's teachings point us to a radical possibility. The life we yearn for, the freedom we crave, isn't hidden in some distant paradise or locked away behind years of impossible effort. It's closer than our next breath, closer than the thoughts passing through our mind. It's so close, in fact, that we overlook it every single day. And yet, the word enlightenment carries so many myths. Some imagine it as a lightning bolt splitting the sky, a cosmic revelation only a chosen few can reach. Others picture it as an escape from reality, a numbing of feelings, a withdrawal from life's joys and sorrows. But the truth, if we dare to look, might be something beautifully simple, disarmingly ordinary, and more transformative than any fantasy. Enlightenment is not a trophy for the spiritual elite. It's not a final destination for perfect beings. It's the birthright of every human being who longs to stop running, who wants to rest in the fullness of what they already are. It's the end of the restless hunger for more, the quiet realization that nothing is missing. It's not about reaching a place beyond this world, but waking up to the miracle of this very moment. Imagine you've been searching your entire life for a treasure, turning over every stone, wandering every road, begging at every door. And then one morning, as the first light spills across your room, you notice a small box on your bedside table. You open it, and there lies the very jewel you've been seeking, glimmering softly, patiently waiting. You realize it's been there all along. That moment of recognition, that gentle homecoming, is the essence of awakening. It's not something that happens to someone else. It's what happens when the veil of "I need more" dissolves, and you discover the freedom of simply being. In this exploration, we won't chase grand promises or spin tales of supernatural bliss. Instead, we'll look directly at what the Buddha actually taught about enlightenment, why it matters, what it truly feels like, and how it can transform our ordinary days into something extraordinary. We'll weave together timeless teachings with stories of real people who have touched glimpses of this peace. And perhaps, by the end, you might sense the possibility of this freedom in your own heart. Because what if the very thing you've been searching for is quietly waiting, right where you are right now? So if enlightenment isn't a cosmic explosion or a divine prize, then what is it, really? The Buddha taught that awakening is not about gaining something new, but seeing through what was never true. It's not a grand addition to who you are. It's a gentle subtraction. Like waking up one morning to find the heaviness you carried for years has simply fallen away. It can feel as subtle as noticing you've been clenching your jaw for decades, and for the first time, letting it relax. Or like realizing you've been walking in circles chasing a sense of completeness, only to stop, turn around, and see that you were always standing on solid ground. This shift doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It arrives in quiet moments. A sudden clarity while washing dishes, an unexplainable peace while sitting in traffic, a fleeting sense of wholeness in the middle of heartache. Moments when you notice the mind no longer grasping for answers, no longer trying to hold life in a tight fist. Thoughts still arise, of course, they always will, but they lose their power to bind you. The constant tension of needing everything to make sense, to fit your expectations, begins to dissolve. It's like watching a tightly wound knot slowly unravel, strand by strand, until there's nothing left to hold you back. This spaciousness of mind has been compared by Buddhist masters to the sky itself, open, vast, unburdened. Clouds of thoughts drift by, storms of emotion roll through, but the sky remains unchanged, untouched. And then something even more extraordinary happens. The sense of a solid, separate self starts to fade. You may still hear, see, taste, feel, but the inner narrator who constantly claims each experience as mine grows quiet. Life continues, vibrant and rich, but there's no longer a desperate need to insert yourself at the center of every moment. It's like listening so deeply to a beautiful piece of music that, for a few heartbeats, you forget there's a listener. You become one with the music. There's just the sound, flowing and alive. Even emotions lose their old grip. Anger might arise like a summer storm, sharp, powerful, but it soon passes without the voice saying, "I am angry, I must act on this." Joy dances lightly through a moment, then fades. Sadness, too, moves like rain across the landscape of your heart, nourishing it rather than drowning it. This isn't detachment in the sense of indifference. Quite the opposite. It's a new kind of intimacy, one without control. You feel life more fully than ever before, yet without needing it to conform to your desires. Like standing barefoot in a field as the wind rushes past. Nothing to hold, nothing to resist. And what about pain? Bodies still hurt, injuries still throb, sickness still brings discomfort. But something profound shifts. The mental story that turns pain into suffering, the "why me? This shouldn't be happening," begins to fall silent. What's left is just the raw, honest sensation of pain, like ripples on a quiet pond. And when you don't resist it, even pain softens. In these glimpses of awakening, you begin to see what the Buddha meant. Enlightenment is not about escaping life, but meeting it so completely that nothing is left outside your embrace. As the mind grows quiet and the endless grasping begins to fade, something even more subtle and astonishing reveals itself. The sense of being a separate me starts to dissolve. Not all at once and not forever, but in moments of clear seeing, the illusion of a fixed, isolated self begins to loosen its grip. We are so accustomed to living life through the lens of I, me, mine. Every experience is filtered through this narrator. I am happy, I am sad. I am right, I am wrong. This narrator shapes every thought, colors every feeling, and creates the exhausting burden of maintaining a personal story. But when you start to see beyond this filter, life changes. Experiences still happen. The wind caresses your skin, birdsong fills your ears, your heart beats steadily. But the inner commentator who constantly judges, compares, and claims ownership becomes strangely silent. It's like listening to music with such deep presence that the listener disappears. There is only the music, vibrating and alive. In that moment, you don't feel separated from what you hear. There is no observer standing apart, only the pure, intimate flow of sound. This fading of self doesn't mean you forget your name or can't function in the world. It doesn't mean you become a blank slate. It means you begin to recognize that the solid I you've spent your life defending and embellishing is more like a thought than a fact. You see that this me is built from memories, hopes, fears, social conditioning, all of it changing moment by moment. Just like a rainbow depends on rain and sunlight, your sense of self depends on countless shifting conditions. And when you see this clearly, there's a profound release. You're no longer trapped in a prison of self-centeredness. Life becomes lighter, more fluid. You move through the world with less defensiveness, less need to prove yourself, less fear of losing what you think you own. Emotions still arise, but they are no longer so sticky. Anger flares like a sudden gust, then passes. Joy bubbles up, then fades. Sadness comes like a soft rain, then clears. But none of these emotions are mine in the old way. They are simply energies moving through an open space. This is not cold detachment. It's a new kind of intimacy. When there's no tight self holding on, you can feel every moment more vividly, love more deeply, grieve more honestly. You're not pushing life away or trying to hoard it. You're simply present, fully here. The Buddha described this as anatta, not self. He didn't mean you don't exist at all, but that the fixed, separate identity you cling to is an illusion. And when you see through that illusion, you realize you were never as alone or isolated as you feared. The boundaries between you and the world soften. You don't just feel love, you are love. You don't just seek peace, you are peace. And in that space of no separation, compassion naturally arises. Because when there's no rigid me, there's no rigid other. Everyone and everything becomes part of the same unfolding dance of life. This is the quiet miracle of awakening. When the self becomes transparent, the heart opens wider than you ever thought possible. So if awakening is this subtle shift in seeing, this dissolving of the separate self, what then is nirvana? And how is it different from enlightenment? The Buddha's teachings draw a delicate but important distinction. Enlightenment, or awakening, is the clear seeing of reality as it truly is, seeing through illusions of self, of permanence, of control. It's like waking up from a restless dream and realizing the dream was never real. You find clarity, freedom, a fresh sense of wonder. But nirvana goes one step further. It is not just the seeing, but the complete extinguishing of the fires that fuel our suffering, the fires of craving, hatred, and ignorance. While enlightenment is like the moment the door of your cage swings open, nirvana is the peace you find when you step through that door and no longer feel the urge to return. The Buddha described nirvana not as a place you reach, but as a state beyond birth and death, beyond coming and going. He said, "There is, monks, that which is not born, not made, not created, not conditioned. This is nirvana." To our ordinary mind, that might sound abstract, distant, even frightening. But to those who glimpse it, nirvana feels more natural than anything else. It's like finally returning home after a lifetime wandering through strange lands. It's like remembering something so fundamental you can't believe you ever forgot. What changes when you step into nirvana? It's not that life suddenly becomes perfect or that pain ceases to exist. Bodies still age and die. Accidents still happen. But the mental resistance, the story of this shouldn't be, the clinging to my way or nothing, all of that gently dissolves. You see pain as pain without the suffering born from resisting it. You see joy as joy without desperately grasping to make it stay forever. Everything is allowed to come and go in its own time, like waves rising and falling in the vast ocean. The peace of nirvana comes not from controlling life, but from releasing the illusion that you ever could. And in that release, there is a stillness so complete that nothing can disturb it. Think of enlightenment as the moment the sun breaks through the clouds, illuminating the world with sudden clarity. Think of nirvana as the steady, unwavering light of that sun at midday, no longer flickering between clouds and clear sky, but resting in a boundless expanse of light. One is the seeing, the other is the deep freedom born of seeing. One ends confusion, the other ends suffering. Enlightenment shows you the nature of reality. Nirvana is resting in the peace that this understanding brings. This is why the Buddha didn't speak of nirvana as something you build or achieve. He spoke of it as something uncovered when everything false falls away, like removing layers of dust from a mirror until it reflects the world with perfect clarity. And in that mirror, you don't see a perfected self. You see the world as it is, intimate, alive, free from the illusions that once bound you. You see yourself not as a separate wave struggling alone, but as the ocean itself. vast, deep, and profoundly at peace. Why do we humans, across every culture, every continent, every age, feel this deep longing for something more? Why do our hearts ache with the sense that there's a peace we haven't yet found, a home we've never quite reached? This yearning is universal, timeless. Like a flower turning instinctively toward the sun, the human heart turns toward a peace beyond words, a wholeness beyond circumstances. It's what drives us to seek wisdom, to look beyond the mundane, to wonder about the meaning of life. All spiritual traditions have given names and shapes to this ultimate peace. In Hinduism, sages speak of Aham Brahmasmi, I am the Absolute. They teach that the individual self was never truly separate from the vast, cosmic reality. It's like a wave recognizing it was never apart from the ocean. It was ocean expressing itself as a wave. In the mystical branch of Islam, the Sufis speak of fana, the complete dissolution of the separate self into divine love. They describe it beautifully. Like a drop of water falling into the sea, realizing it was never truly apart. Their poetry sings of union so complete it brings tears of relief and joy. Christian mystics speak of union with God, of surrendering personal will into divine will, letting the small self fall away so that love can move freely. They describe it not as a harsh erasure, but as the gentlest homecoming, like falling asleep in the embrace of perfect love. In Taoism, the sages teach the art of Wu Wei, acting without forcing, moving in harmony with the Tao, the natural flow of existence. It's like a leaf floating effortlessly on a river, turning with the current rather than resisting it. There's wisdom in this softness, a reminder that bending is often stronger than breaking. These paths, though diverse, share a luminous thread. They all point to the end of the separate, seeking self. They all tell the same secret in different words. When the tight knot of me unravels, peace blossoms naturally. But Buddhism offers a unique, profound perspective. Instead of describing enlightenment as merging with a cosmic self or discovering an eternal essence, the Buddha invites us to look deeply at the very idea of something ultimate. And what do we find? We find emptiness. Not empty like a cold void, but empty of the solid, unchanging existence we imagine. Like space itself. Not a dead nothingness, but the very condition that allows everything to arise and pass away. Emptiness is what makes the dance of life possible. The Buddha taught dependent origination. Everything exists because of countless causes and conditions. Your thoughts depend on your brain, your culture, your language. Your body depends on food, air, warmth, love. Nothing stands alone. Nothing exists independently. It's like a symphony. No single note makes sense by itself. Only together do the notes create music. And so, life is a grand symphony of interdependence, everything touching everything else in a vast, ever-changing web. This realization can feel disorienting at first. We're so used to seeking something permanent to hold on to. But those who see emptiness describe it not as a cold abyss, but as a profound fullness, full of life, full of love, full of possibility. Because when you see how connected everything truly is, how nothing exists apart, you also see how precious every moment, every being, every breath becomes. Emptiness, then, is not the absence of meaning. It's the space that allows infinite meaning to unfold. This is why, in Buddhism, enlightenment isn't about merging with an ultimate thing. It's about waking up to the dance of causes and conditions, letting go of the illusion of a separate self, and opening fully to life as it is, impermanent, interconnected, and indescribably alive. As we begin to sense what awakening truly is, an honest question naturally arises. If we haven't experienced full enlightenment ourselves, how can we speak of it with integrity? How do we know what is true and what is merely an echo of someone else's words? This question touches the heart of spiritual honesty, and it is a question the Buddha himself would have welcomed. Because in a world full of opinions and borrowed ideas, the willingness to say, "I don't know," can be more powerful than any claim of certainty. When we approach these teachings with humility, without pretending to know what we haven't yet seen, something authentic begins to emerge. We stop chasing spiritual status or trying to impress others with mystical jargon. We simply sit with our questions, tender and raw, sharing the journey rather than selling answers. There's a beauty in this shared curiosity. It's like sitting around a fire on a quiet night, each of us gazing into the same flames, wondering together about the mystery of life. No one needs to dominate. No one needs to be right. The questions themselves become a form of practice, softening our hearts, opening our minds. So how can we recognize authentic spiritual guidance? The Buddha offered a simple but profound test. Don't look at someone's words alone. Look at how they live. Are they peaceful, or do they argue and divide? Are they generous, or do they crave praise and power? Do they help without asking for something in return? A teacher who has truly touched freedom is like a candle lighting other candles. They don't lose anything themselves. They don't need to claim specialness or gather followers. Their presence itself inspires, comforts, and invites others to see their own light. And the Buddha gave a radical reminder: don't believe something just because it sounds wise or comes from an authority, even himself. Test it in your own life. See if it leads to more kindness, more peace, more freedom from suffering. Truth doesn't require your belief. It simply is, like water being wet whether you believe in it or not. Then comes perhaps the most surprising insight. The spiritual path is not about becoming special or reaching a final goal. It's about seeing through the illusion that there was ever something missing. It's about discovering that what we are searching for has been quietly here all along. Enlightenment isn't a prize waiting at the end of a marathon. It's the discovery that the race itself was imaginary. The moment we stop running from our fears, our pain, our sense of lack, we find we are already home. This is why many masters call awakening the end of seeking. Not because life becomes dull or stagnant, but because the restless search for something to complete us has fallen away. We are finally able to be present with what is, alive, vibrant, tender, without needing it to be different. It's like realizing you've been looking everywhere for your glasses, only to discover they were on your head the whole time. Or like searching your whole life for a treasure, only to find it hidden in your own heart. And so, authenticity on the path of awakening is not measured by mystical experiences or complex philosophies. It is measured by honesty, by kindness, by the courage to sit quietly with the deepest questions of your own heart, by the willingness to stop running and start being fully, tenderly here. So what truly happens when you reach enlightenment? Perhaps the most surprising answer is, nothing happens, and yet everything changes. Nothing happens because you don't become someone new or reach some distant destination. The person you thought you were simply falls away, like mist dissolving in the morning sun. The restless search that fueled so much of your life, this need to fix, to chase, to become, gently comes to an end. And yet everything changes because the world is seen with fresh eyes. Moments that once seemed ordinary glow with quiet wonder. The simplest things, a bird singing outside your window, the feeling of your breath, the warmth of a friend's hand, become gateways to the sacred. The cage you thought you were trapped in was never locked. The door was always open. And now, in the soft light of clear seeing, you realize you were never truly apart from the peace you sought. Coming home to this reality doesn't mean life becomes perfect. Pain still comes, losses still hurt, but suffering, the mental struggle that says this shouldn't be, fades into silence. You rest in a deep, unshakable peace that holds both joy and sorrow with gentle compassion. This is the quiet miracle the Buddha spoke of. When there is no one left to be enlightened, Nirvana simply is. There is nothing missing, nothing extra. Just the pure stillness of a heart unbound. So if you feel lost, if you feel tired of striving, remember, the treasure you seek is not far away. It's as close as your own breath, as immediate as this very moment. Enlightenment is not a reward waiting at the end of a long road. It is the discovery that you were always home, that the love, peace, and freedom you yearn for have never been outside of you. As we close this journey together, take a moment to breathe. Feel the ground beneath you. Sense the life moving within you. And know, you are not broken, you are not lacking. You are whole right here, right now. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of awakening and nirvana. May these reflections remind you of your own inner light, and may you walk this life with open eyes, a tender heart, and the quiet confidence that you are already enough. Until next time, may you be happy, may you be peaceful, and may you always remember, you are home.